Hello, and thanks for listening to Forward, a podcast about the compelling stories, important issues, and memorable art that move us. My name is Mari.
And my name is Christopher.
Thanks for joining us.
Today, we're talking about play. You know, that thing kids do when they're not at school or doing homework, and specifically how the idea of play can fit into an adult's life. Before that, we'll get started with our Article Forward segment, where we each share 2 stories that got us thinking this week. Mari, what do you have for us?
So this is an article from NPR. It's called, Is It Time to Bring Risk Back into Our Kids' Playgrounds? Basically, it says there's a growing movement in the UK to integrate risk into playgrounds. You know, things like tall structures, having bushes that are kind of spiky and just leaving them in the play area, allowing children to build fires in the play area, under supervision. But, having that sort of element of risk where there's a little bit of danger and the kids need to navigate that. And so that's a growing movement, like I said, in the UK. And the article is kind of saying, are we going to start seeing this more in the US? And they referenced the free range kids movement, which is sort of gaining traction in some parts of the US. It's basically the idea that you can let your kids go out and, go play in the neighborhood and take the bus by themselves or with their friends, and that you don't need to be supervising them 100% of the time. And so this kind of goes along with that a little bit, where it's like giving kids opportunity to assess risks for themselves. And the article is saying that allowing kids to experience risk in these sort of controlled ways helps them build the skills that they need in order to navigate real risks in real life. And so it's definitely something that I'm interested in, something we'll talk about a little bit, I think, in our discussion later. There's actually a good quote in here about play and about like risk in play and how it's important for kids, and it kind of like comes from this like evolutionary heritage that we have as primates. They said, I would say that risk and risky play in particular is a vital part of our animal primate heritage. It is through our engagement with risk or any unfamiliar or uncomfortable situation in the context of play, which is of course fun for a juvenile animal of any species, but in other contexts as well, that we learn how to use our bodies safely to interact with the physical and social changes in the environment. And I definitely agree with that. I think that giving kids the opportunity to exercise their skills and, use their bodies and even just understand how their bodies work and like getting their balance and understanding how strong they are and like what they can do and getting better at those things so that they can navigate, real risks in the future is something that's really important. So I thought it was an interesting article, just a short article from NPR, kind of about these trends and like interviewing a couple people about building risk into kids' play and like what that can do for them.
No, it's really cool. So my article is called I'm Not Black, I'm Kanye. So there's obviously no shortage of articles dissecting Kanye West's recent comments about his love of Trump and their dragon energy connection. But if there was one writer I could really count on to say something above the rest, it was going to be Tallahassee Coates, who's the author of the best-selling book Between the World and Me and Marvel's Black Panther comic. In his article in The Atlantic, Coates makes the case that what's behind Kanye's Trump comments and some of his more controversial behavior over the last year is a desire for freedom, white freedom. Coates supports his case with a story of another black icon's rise and fall, Michael Jackson. He talks about his experience discovering Jackson as a boy and the profound impact that had on him and the black community, and that to many people, Jackson was essentially God, given his elevated and otherworldly place in their society. It's this elevated stature and fame that has the power to distort one's perspective and make people feel above the limitations of their day-to-day life, similar to the freedoms of people who are white and wealthy sometimes experience. And Coates himself is actually no stranger to the dangers of fame, which he talks about at length in the article. In his own words, he actually says in 2015, he was the recipient of a mere fraction of the kind of celebrity that Kanye West enjoys. And as a result, he says, quote unquote, he almost lost his mind. Coates weaves in his own experiences along with Jackson's legacy and West's ever-present stardom to create this really honest story about fame and humility and one's desires and their limitations. If you're a Kanye West fan or just kind of fascinated with the lives of the icons that shape our culture, I think this article is definitely worth a read.
Awesome. That sounds really cool. Definitely always interested to hear from Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Next up is our forward thinking segment. In this segment, we take a closer look at one topic that's been on our minds. This episode, we're taking the issue of play seriously, or at least discussing from a more scientific perspective what it means to play and how this activity can fit into adults' lives, which we more often associate with work than the free-spirited lives of children. We all know what it means for kids to play, or at least we think we do. Most of us picture kids having fun in the park, riding their bikes aimlessly on sticky summer days, and throwing, shooting, or kicking some kind of ball around. However, according to experts in the field of child development, play is actually a very specific term used to describe a specific type of activity. Almost all instances of play share the same core principles. And these same experts agree that regardless of what form it takes, play is not only essential to a child's mental and physical development, which we talked about a little bit earlier, but also just to a person's well-being. However, for most adults, the last time they played was in college, or maybe their last short vacation from work. How can this idea of play better fit into their lives? Mari, before we get started, perhaps we share some of the core principles that define play according to the experts in the field.
For sure. So Christopher and I went to a lecture recently, which is sort of where this stems from. It was a lecture by Peter Gray, who is an expert in this field, and he's written a lot about it. He has a TED Talk. He's really great. Definitely recommend checking him out. Do a little Google. You will learn a lot. And he proposed 5 aspects that define play, and this educative sort of play that children are naturally inclined to do if you let them. And they are as follows. 1, play is self-chosen and self-directed. Players are always free to quit. 2, play is activity in which means are more valued than ends. 3, play is guided by mental rules. 4, play is non-literal, imaginative, marked off in some way from reality. And 5, play involves an active, alert, but non-stressed frame of mind. So basically what this means is that play is an activity that you choose to do yourself. This is something that you want to do. You're not being rewarded for doing this. You won't be punished if you don't do it. It's just something that you choose to do, and you are free to stop doing it at any time. The process is what is important rather than the product of what you're doing. So, when you think about kids playing in the sort of like classic sense, not in this sort of like more organized sports sort of that we're more used to seeing now, you think about, kids making up a game, right? They start off with a ball and they're kind of just like kicking it around, but then they start to say, well, okay, so you have to kick it this way and you have to hit it on this tree and you have to do this and blah, blah, blah. And they kind of keep making up these new rules and adjusting to the rules and teaching other kids the rules. And they may or may not even be keeping score. They may or may not care who wins. It's more about just like, okay, this is how you do it. See if you can get the ball over there. See if you can do it in one kick. See if you can do it like this. And it's much more about the process. That also goes into rule number 3, which is that play is guided by mental rules. And a lot of people, when they think about play, they think of it as just like a sort of free, casual, like no rules, no structure sort of thing. But Dr. Gray argues that that's not true. In fact, like in the example I just described, anytime kids or, adults who are engaging in real play come together, rules start to develop naturally. But the important thing is that they come from the players and they're made up by the players and all the players agree to them. And that's kind of the core of any game, right? Is that, okay, these are the rules. And if you don't play by these rules, you're not really playing the game. But the important thing about this sort of educative play that we're talking about is that the rules come from the players. And it's something that they all choose together, and there's negotiation involved, and there's talking involved. And they, it's this something that's developed through this like social activity. Another thing that's really important in those rules is that play involves an active, alert, but non-stressed frame of mind. And Dr. Gray refers to this also as something that's been called flow, where you get into this state of mind where you're in the groove, you're you're alert, you're active, like maybe even you're working hard, but you're not stressed. Like this is just like what you like to do, and you're doing it and it feels good. So that's kind of the backbone of what we're talking about here, is like these sort of core principles of how Dr. Gray defines play. And you could even see just in those rules how activities like that would be not just fun, but also really restorative and really freeing, and also a great way to learn things, you know, because you're intrinsically motivated to do it.
No, totally. And for me, for this whole discussion, before I could really leap into thinking about how someone who's older could incorporate play into their lives, you have to address one thing, and that's the time limitations that are placed on someone who is working or someone who is at least 21 years of age.
Mm-hmm.
And just for a fun exercise, because I feel like I've always had this in my head, I started to jot down realistically how many hours in the day would you have to play. Ultimately, after this whole exercise, I ended up in a best case scenario, you have about 3 hours of freedom. And that's when you take out work. That's when you take out your commute, getting ready for work, kind of coming home and putting your bag away or whatever else you need
eating
to do.
dinner, sleeping.
And so really at the end of the day, 3 hours of freedom. But that is even maybe a little too generous. I really left us with 2 hours. In this 3 hour scenario, you literally don't talk to your partner or your spouse at all. There's no time for talking. So, you know, you got to assume you need to be a human. So 2 hours that you could potentially play a day, I would say is a pretty daunting barrier just to start with.
But, you know, you think about like kids playing, like sometimes it takes 30 minutes to figure out what you want to do and like get into the game and like decide how it's going to go and like make up those mental rules and stuff. That's even a huge barrier in and of itself, is like, what do I do? You know, as an adult, I think it's such a hard thing to even figure out what you want to do in your free time, if you have free time, you know.
Well, I'm actually glad you brought that up. In my notes, I have a section titled, "What are even some examples of the way that some adult could play?" Because it's so not familiar. Again, when you only have 2 hours, let's say, and you only have yourself, play's kind of lonely. Most play you're used to doing with someone else.
Right.
And kind of what I was thinking about is, I think the closest way to describe play for someone who's older is their hobby. Most often, hobbies are play, but not all play is a hobby. Because hobby is something that you do over long periods of time, and it's a piece of your life. Play sometimes is just a one-off thing for the most part, and I don't think adults know how to even do that.
Yeah, you know, I think especially in American culture, right? There's always this feeling of you need to be productive, you need to be working towards something. You know, there needs to be a product, right? We're very product focused. Like, what's the point of this? What are you getting out of it? What's going to be the end result of whatever you're doing? And the idea being that if there isn't a product, or if you kind of don't have a product in mind and you're not really thinking about it, that you're wasting your time. Dr. Gray would argue that exactly the opposite is true, because the process is what's important.
Yeah, going to that lecture and just thinking more about this and even reading more about this, it's been oddly liberating for me, solely in the sense that there's been so many small activities I wanted to do over the years, and I've literally not done them, even though I know I would have a fun time, because I'm like, what's the point? What's the purpose of me doing this frivolous activity? And then now when I look back, I'm like, I was brainwashed.
Totally. You're brainwashed by society.
Yes.
It's interesting you use the word frivolous, because that's something that Dr. Gray talks about too, is that, you know, play is thought of as frivolous. And he said, well, you know, it's interesting. It's kind of a paradox, because it is frivolous, but it's also crucial and important and not frivolous at all. But part of what makes play great for learning, and like something that kids and adults actually want to do, and the thing that makes it not stressful, is that it's frivolous. You know, nothing is depending on this. You know, your paycheck isn't depending on it. Your life isn't depending on it. It's just something to do that's enjoyable. And that's what makes it important.
I think the funniest thing for me is I definitely did think that it was frivolous, but play obviously brings you joy. So by extension, I thought joy was frivolous, right?
Dude.
That like I didn't need to have joy in my day, right?
No, I think that is exactly what American work culture makes people think.
No, I mean, you kind of get this idea that if you're unproductive, you're lazy, which I feel like we've talked about on a previous podcast.
Yep.
And even if you're having too much fun, like you're not working hard enough.
Like you're doing something wrong.
You're
like
doing something wrong.
Yeah, you shouldn't be having that much fun. It's not fair.
No, and no one ever says that to a kid, obviously, right?
Dude, they do though. In my student teaching, there's this one kid who like just likes to make other people laugh, and so he'll kind of like goof around a little bit, and he gets wailed on every time by the teacher, who's just like, "What are you doing? You should be working." Blah blah blah. And this kid's 4,
Yeah.
And I think that even kids are getting this, and that's kind of another conversation for another day. But I think that's part of the problem, is that this, our like work obsessed culture is filtering down even into little kids, and play is disappearing not just from adults' lives but from kids' lives too.
Well, and when you really consider all the benefits of play, you start to really question, like, oh my God, why haven't I been doing this more? And in the lecture we went to, they focused on mostly the benefits for kids. I just did this little exercise on my own to figure out what's kind of the natural extension for people who are older. And we talked about this already. Like, obviously, there's a fun component. There's joy, which is needed. There's this sense of that you feel accomplished, that you're doing something. You kick the ball the farthest, if that's the rules of the game. And that makes you feel good. It's an outlet for you to express yourself. It helps you discover yourself kind of on the same extension. And it just gives you this sense of freedom. And after listening to all this stuff out, I'm like, all that sounds really great. Why don't we do more of this?
Exactly. Well, like, if you don't mind, I'd like to talk a little bit about play in the context of kids, to maybe give it a little bit more context. So like kind of everything we've been saying, but a lot of the sort of alternative educational models that people know about, like particularly like Montessori is the most famous, but there's also progressive education from John Dewey. Reggio Emilia is a big one. Waldorf is another one. High Scope. But all of these different like educational models are models for schools. Like, they're intended to be for schools, and like some of them are for little kids, some of them are meant for older kids. Like Montessori can go up through high school, but what they all have in common is that the students are intended to choose what they work on, choose what they do, and they work independently or with other students. But the idea is that they have materials that they can work with and play with. They choose what they're working on, and they are deciding kind of how to spend their time, and like they're using the materials constructively to explore. And it's been shown that in these models, which are so counter to the way that traditional public education is in the United States, kids learn stuff. Like in Montessori, young kids learn how to multiply and divide, and they are able to do it because they have good materials that have like a purpose, but they are also able to learn because they're interested in it, and they choose to do it. And I think that adults can see that in their own lives, where it's so much easier to learn something when you care about it.
Oh, I mean, everything meaningful I've learned over the last maybe even 3 or 4 years, I learned solely because it was self-motivated. And it's actually helped me in work too. But I never would have learned it otherwise.
Totally. And, everyone can identify with the experience of like being in high school or, middle school or elementary school, and the teacher's droning on about something and you don't remember it now, obviously, because you didn't care. It was boring. It wasn't something that you wanted to do. Someone else was forcing you to do it. And if someone else is forcing you to do something, it's just not going to be meaningful to you, and you're not going to get anything out of it.
I love that you use the word meaningful, because at the end of my exercise to write out all the benefits of play, what I kind of came to the conclusion is play one of the very few things, kind of besides love of other people, that gives your life meaning.
Yeah. I think even having the opportunity to explore, and kind of like I was talking about in the article about risk, like getting to know like how your body works, and also getting to know yourself in social situations and see how you react to things and like learning how to interact with other people constructively. Those are things that will make life easier for you all around. Like not just in the workplace, but just everything in your life will be much easier for you and much better if you are able to develop those skills. And what Dr. Gray was arguing is that the best way to develop those skills is through free play. And I think that as an adult, like even though maybe you're not intending to try to learn stuff through your play, like you were just saying, you do learn stuff naturally. It just happens. Like a good example is if you're trying to learn how to draw, you kind of just start. It's fun. You like it. You do it a little bit. You try to draw something. You kind of pick it up every now and then. And then in the process of just doing it because you like to do it, you get better at it because that's what practicing is. But it's not like the mandated hour of piano practicing that your parents made you do. It's just your play, and you learn how to get better just through this natural process.
Yeah, I mean, just the sheer fact that I like to write, I think my emotional development has been vastly improved through this largely frivolous activity. The world isn't waiting on my next masterpiece, right? But it's something I do, and it's something I use to explore my thoughts, and that pays dividends everywhere in terms of even just my relationship with you and my friends. I have a better understanding of the world, and that just didn't come from nowhere, but it came from this frivolous activity. It was great.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing that Dr. Gray kind of argued was that for kids, play it's a social thing. Like you play with other kids, and like playing by yourself doesn't have the same kind of like meaning, and it isn't as educative as playing with other kids. And when you talk about like the social development and that kind of thing, you can totally understand where that comes from. I do think though, as adults, having play by yourself is not necessarily a bad thing, especially when you're talking about something like writing or drawing. Writing and drawing are pretty solitary activities. It's something that you kind of do like you and your tools and your mind. And I think, like you were saying, that is kind of where hobbies come from. It's that instinct that we have to play. That is in every human. And I think because we're so overworked, when you're not working, you want to just do nothing because you're so tired. And so I think that even hobbies are kind of falling away because at the end of the day, you don't even have the energy to try to draw or do something like that. So you just watch Netflix.
No, I mean, that is one of the biggest barriers outside of time. Because what I wrote down in my exercise, I got to 2 hours. But realistically, even that is a lie. It's really 1 hour, at least depending on where you place the hour. If it's the first thing you do in the morning, you hear about people all the time going to the gym before work or getting up to read or something like that. That's truly full energy. They can have play. Trying to think you're going to do something in the evening? No way.
Yeah, you're exhausted, man.
You're beat.
Yeah.
So the time is really a huge component, plus the energy. It almost drops the availability down to zero.
Yeah, it's like you only have time on the weekend.
And again, kind of everything we talked about, you really kind of get in better touch with yourself through play. And it's weird to think that you don't have energy to be yourself. Because even in these mindless activities, they're exactly that. They're mindless. You're just this husk for content on Netflix and Facebook.
Yeah, so it's like it's not just the time, right? It's the energy. The energy to actually do something. Play does take energy. It doesn't stress you out, so it doesn't expend your energy in that way. But you need to be able to do something, And there could be arguments to be made for like, oh, maybe like some types of content consumption can be considered play. Sure. And that's maybe like another conversation. But yeah, in general, like play is doing something, And when you're so exhausted from your day at work, you can't you feel like you can't do anything.
No, I mean, I wrote down a few ideas about how adults can play more, just to try to test myself to see if it was really possible. And we actually touched on a few of them here. But I think that idea of scheduling is so important. When you're grown, if you want it done, you got to schedule it. And it sounds so lame because it feels like you're about to turn play into work, but you do need to kind of manage your life. It just doesn't happen. But that idea of not turning play into work, I mean, that's the greatest fault of my life. Because you get so brainwashed into being productive and managing a project and producing something that almost just kind of over the last couple of months, I've started to unwind and realize that I've kind of been self-sabotaging a lot of my play and turning it into work, into a product that needs to be presented. To whom? I don't know. No one's waiting for it except for me.
Yeah, no, and I think even this podcast is a good example. It's just kind of something that we wanted to do. And, I know a little bit about, audio stuff and whatever. And, you are good with the sort of writing and research portion. And so we kind of were just like, we'll figure it out. Let's just we know enough that we'll just kind of start recording and kind of see where it goes. And yeah, I think just in the process of doing it, we've kind of come up with better ways to think about it and better ways to do it. And hopefully we're getting better. I don't know. You guys can tell us. But it's mostly just something that's enjoyable to do. We like the process of doing it. And I'm not super concerned with how many people are listening to it or anything like that. Putting it out and editing it and finishing it and putting it out is part of the process, and that's enjoyable too. But I'm not concerned about getting famous or anything off of this podcast. It's just fun.
Well, and it's so funny you bring up all that, because even in the earlier days of the podcast, which we're still in the early days, this is what, like the eighth episode, I was more focused on we gotta hit this deadline for doing the podcast. Again, this imaginary audience is waiting for my work. And it just kind of poisons the whole well, and suddenly it's not fun. It's not an area where you can fail, which I think is absolutely crucial, because really, how else are you going to learn? No one's great at everything. And I think even the fact that it's something we put out on social media, there's some kind of accountability where if I don't do it, I feel like my friends are going to be like, look at that. They started something. They're lazy. They stopped doing it. They can't commit to anything.
That's funny.
And I know they wouldn't actually think that, but
no.
Just even the idea of social media turns your life into work a little bit, right?
Well,
You're kind of finding the latest thing to broadcast, produce something. It's exhausting.
I mean, that even kind of goes back to one of our earlier conversations where social media turns your life into content.
Yeah.
And in that way, it also kind of turns your life into product, right?
I distinctly remember times kind of coming home from work thinking I haven't posted on some social channel in a while. I should probably capture a picture. Even to say it now, I feel like an idiot.
Right.
Go on.
Well, it's so funny. The more you talk about play and kind of different things that go into it, the more I see that you can apply these principles to really anything. You can apply it to a person's use of social media. Let's say, you're like me and you like Instagram. If you are super focused on the number of likes and the number of followers and stuff like that, it starts to become work, and you can stress yourself out that way by focusing on this sort of end product of your posting, when at the end of the day, that's something you can't control. You can't control how many people like your posts or how many people are following you, but if you're more interested in just taking nice pictures that you like and you think are cool and making them look as good as you can and posting it to share with your friends or whatever, then it's more of a play situation where that's something that, you're exercising a certain skill, photography, and you're or photo editing, and you're kind of thinking about things in different ways, and it's something that you can get some meaning out of.
I'm actually really glad you said all that, because despite me kind of shaming myself earlier and saying that I'm, paranoid about my rate of content creation, I think realistically using Instagram in just a frivolous way has made me so much more of a visual thinker, and I've gotten progressively better at editing photos and
Mm-hmm.
thinking about how a photo's composed. And I'm like the least visual thinker ever.
Yeah, you're a words guy.
Yeah, but I do feel so much more capable now than even just I was a couple years ago because I never took any photos. I
Right.
never had to think about what makes a good photo because I just took whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But having to take the extra step of putting it out there induced this part to the process where I'm like, oh, I'm going to think about that and practice and get
Mm-hmm.
better.
Right. Well, and that's kind of another thing that Dr. Gray brought up is that once you get a little bit better at it, the level at which you were doing it in the beginning becomes boring because, it's not fun to do something that you already know how to do and is like really easy. So then you start challenging yourself, and because challenging yourself makes it more fun. And obviously the more you challenge yourself, and as long as it keeps being fun, you're going to keep doing it, and the more you challenge yourself, the better you're going to get. And you start kind of taking in even like other aspects of it. Like, let's say it's singing. At first you're kind of just like thinking about like your pitch and the volume of your voice, but then as you kind of get onto another level, you start thinking about all these other things like your breath and like how your posture and harmonizing and stuff like that, because as things become easy, you want to make it more challenging because then it's more fun, and that's how you learn things.
No, totally. I mean, I think the best part is we've talked a lot about the high barriers to play, but really in other respects the barriers are much lower. If you want to learn something, it's easier than ever to go on the internet and just get the tools to get started. And I do think that social media is a positive influence in the sense that in many regards it forces you to be more creative, be more thoughtful, and it's not like you're trying to compete for likes, but you're trying to have a genuine expression, and you can't express yourself in an honest way if you don't think about it.
Mm-hmm, for sure. And like we were just talking about with the Instagram thing, I think that if you are thoughtful and if you have a genuine interest in something, you can kind of make almost anything into play for yourself. And it doesn't have to be like a big hobby like woodworking or something like that. Like you can make Instagram into your little hobby, and it doesn't have to be that serious. I agree with what you're saying about having like tools and materials available, because that's, like with all those educational models I was talking about, a crucial part of all of those models is that the role of the teacher is to curate and provide an environment and materials so that the kids are able to play. And that is something that is much more available now than it ever was. It's also even easier than ever to just meet people that you can do stuff with.
Yeah.
Like I was in this meetup group where we just got together and sang, and it was super fun. And I was getting, I've been getting better at singing through going to this group, and it's totally play. We just get together and sing, and it's fun.
No, I mean, I just bought this iPad a couple weeks ago, and it's a life changer in the sense it's now this little play device for me, especially after this lecture, where I'm starting to doodle more because I have the tools and it's very low barrier. And I even started on this little app the other day to like learn to code. I'm obviously not going to like go be a hacker in a year or be like a full-time developer, but I like pretending I'm a hacker doing these little puzzles with code.
Yeah.
And it's so much fun, and it brings me so much joy, and it's literally going nowhere.
Well, yeah.
But that's why it's so much fun.
Totally. And I think that it is just pleasurable to learn stuff, and to just do new things and kind of like stretch your brain. I think that is something that humans generally find enjoyable, in whatever way that you do. Like everybody has different interests, but I think kind of stretching your brain and stretching your abilities is something that's fun. And that's why we're wired for play. It's just it's something that we need to do to help us grow, because that's kind of what humans are all about, is just like learning and growing all the time. Just kind of at the end here, I want to like throw out a few like kind of, you were talking about like low barrier sort of ways for adults to play, just to get a little bit of like pleasure and like brain stretching out of your life. Like I think a good example is Instagram, or like, if you're on Twitter and you like kind of writing little quips and stuff, like people are putting out really clever stuff on Twitter. If that's something you're interested in, like that's a way that you can play, as long as, again, you're not too focused on the retweets. Another thing I was just thinking of is if you're into music and you have Spotify, you can curate like really cool playlists and share them with your friends, like really get into like certain types of music and learn all about it. You can get into records and start, just diving into, obscure genres and obscure artists. And that's another way that you can play.
Yeah, and kind of building on that, you mentioned earlier how some forms of content can actually be play. That kind of reminded me, I know at least a few friends who just write short movie reviews online. Mm-hmm. And yes, the world doesn't need another critic. It also doesn't need another podcast, and we still do it.
Yeah, who cares?
But that forces you to think critically about some of the stuff you're watching. Mm-hmm. And it forces you to learn more probably about art and what makes good movies, mm-hmm. and put your thoughts into words and produce a product. That's rewarding in its own right. Mm-hmm. Kind of a few other low barrier things I was thinking of, just like learning a new board game and playing it with friends.
Yeah.
I think that's so much more stimulating, and just the fact that you have to learn something new and think about things in a different way. I mean, board game is almost literally play. Mm-hmm. And even just like going to a lecture or hearing some author talk about their new book, it's just a little bit more stimulating content than watching a show you've seen 1,000 times on Netflix for the 1,000th and first time, which we all do because we need to.
For sure. But yeah, I think even though we're totally overworked and we spend way too much time working and we have no time, at the end of the day for ourselves, I think there are some little ways that you can at least be mindful of how you're spending your time. And if you have a hobby, keeping some of these things in mind to make sure you're not accidentally turning it into work and stressing yourself out for no reason, I think is important, just to, enjoy your life, man, and learn some stuff and grow as a human.
Yeah, I totally agree. Life is meant to be enjoyed.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So if you want to learn more about this topic and read some of the other things that Peter Gray has written, you can go check out his blog,
psychologytoday.com, and it's called The Value of Play. He wrote a whole 5-part series, I think it's 5 parts, on just all of this play and like his research and his philosophies.
Our final segment of the podcast is Watch List. In this segment, we recommend one TV show or movie that's flying beneath the radar but worth checking out. Our watch list recommendation this week is Wild Wild Country. This documentary follows the story of a religious movement that builds this utopian city in the wilderness of Oregon. The movement's ambitious settlement brings its followers into conflict with the long-term residents of a small nearby town. This neighborly disagreement quickly boils over into a national scandal that ends up captivating the country. Quite simply, this documentary had us hooked. It's definitely one of those stories that's so crazy, I wouldn't believe it really happened if the filmmakers didn't have countless of hours of old footage from the time when it actually did happen. And not only is the story gripping, but the show plays with your allegiances in a way that you rarely see in TV. Really, at least for me, I was constantly reevaluating how I feel about both the small town residents and the members of this movement. And so even though you know how the conflict turns out from the very first episode, I would say the stories and the characters really keep you hooked all the way until the very last. So if you're looking for something that's a little bit out of the ordinary, I definitely recommend you check out Wild Wild Country.
Yeah, definitely really interesting documentary. We pretty much tore through that in like 3 days. Highly recommended. Check it out. It's on Netflix. So that's about it for us. If you enjoyed this podcast, search for FWD, that's forward, in iTunes or your favorite podcast app. We are also on Google Play. Or you can subscribe on SoundCloud.
Thank you so much for listening. If you ever have any questions, thoughts, or topic suggestions, you can email us at forwardpodcast@gmail.com. That's fwdpodcast@gmail.com. Goodbye for now.
Bye.